Superversive live stream. Anyone who's listening, thanks for tuning in. We have John and Jaji Wright on tonight, as well as Ben Zvitsky, and we're going to be talking about heroes and villains, what makes them heroic and villainous. So, who wants to go first? Because I think everybody knows everybody.
I think so. John, why don't you start off?
Very well. A hero originally in the ancient Greek world was someone who was sacrificed to Hera, hence the name, hero, for the sake of the good of the community. He would lay down his life in war or in fighting brigands or something in order to preserve the state, in order to preserve the people. So from the get-go, the idea was one of self-sacrifice. Even the most invulnerable villains, like Achilles, always had an Achilles heel. Otherwise, the sacrifice is impossible. Even Superman has to sacrifice himself in terms of dressing up as Clark Kent, or the mild-mannered reporter who can't even get a date with Lois Lane, the hick from Kansas.
Even
Batman
Heracles
had to have his parents killed. Heracles, being attacked by
we
snakes.
usually call him Hercules, but of course he was the knight of Hera. He was Heracles, and he went mad at one point. So
yeah, Heracles actually means glory of Hera.
Yeah,
which is odd because Hera was out to get him.
But if heroes were supposed to be related to Hera, that might be why he was called that.
Now, oddly enough, villains, the word villain originally comes from being a villager, because the courtly manners and the nobility of the nobles in their castles in the Middle Ages was a sharp contrast to the rude and rustic manners and also the dishonorable behavior of the starving villains who would steal and act villainously. And so in the Victorian age, that came to be the word for the antagonist of any story who behaves in an uncomely fashion, in a bizarrely bad fashion. Now, the modern trend that the initial question asks about I joined late. Did the readers, did the listeners hear the?
We just started.
Then
listeners have not heard yet.
Then you should ask the question that we were going to address.
Sorry, one of the other contributors who hasn't been able to make it did ask the question. The rather disturbing. Well, he wanted to explore the idea of the rather disturbing modern trend of making villains into sympathetic characters.
Yeah. Now, the reason I wanted to put that question in front of the listeners is because I wanted to make a comment on it, just even in my opening statement here, because the hero is the guy who sacrificed himself to save the people, and the villain is the guy who's got the rude and rustic behavior of the brigands and the thieves who live in the wilderness, who live in the country. Neither of those fits into the modern category which began at about the turn of the last century among the decadents and among Nietzsche and among the others who thought that morality itself was the bad guy and had to be overcome. In all the ancient literature, the good guys abide by the morality and are sometimes destroyed by it when the price is too high, when the demand is too high for them. Or they prosper and they live happily ever after. And crime doesn't pay. But among the decadents at the turn of the century, it was thought to be more realistic, more progressive, more daring to merely portray the heroes as fools and the villains as the guys who actually understood the way the world really works. And so they were not made sympathetic the way you would sympathize with if your child had committed a crime and you still loved him. They were made sympathetic as if your child was living under the thumb of a tyrant, and every time he did something immoral that was not actually really immoral, it was merely offense against the tyrant and his tyranny. So those villains are very different from real villains. Now, once again, and I want to make a distinction between those kind of villains, the anti-heroes, the people whose mission is to destroy the idea of heroism, to blend villains and heroes together into a single shade of gray where there's no distinction. I want to draw a difference between that and a story where a villain gets redeemed or rectified, which are some of the most impressive and heartwarming stories, heartrending stories that have ever been written. So we have actually 4 different things we're talking about. We're talking about heroes, villains, anti-heroes, and what you might call anti-villains, people who turn over a new leaf.
Some examples. What's the difference between let's say, an anti-hero who's being treated, sympathetically, Darth Vader, who is impressive, and we have a bit of sympathy for. I'm talking about the original movie now. The original 3 movies. At the end.
The one where he's not a whiny teenager who I want to see die.
Or let's say Gru from Despicable Me, who wants to be a villain, but kind of isn't really making it as a villain. It's kind of redeemed against his will. So, I mean, those are kind of 3, and I wish that, David had been able to join us, because I was curious. I'd love to know which of those he feels falls within his example and which might be outside his example.
Would an example of a sympathetic villain, I'm wondering what he means by that.
John lost the signal.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to just try downstairs, Hans? Okay, we're just gonna use the same mic.
Okay.
I mean, it ran out of power.
You can take the plug upstairs. Let's keep going. We'll work out the technical problems.
No, that's okay. So is a sympathetic villain like what was the movie they did with the evil queen from Snow White, and they sort of paint her as
Maleficent.
That's it. Thank you.
Completely and utterly humiliated in that movie.
I haven't seen, but
to quote Maleficent, she was a disgrace to the powers of evil in that movie. Hello?
I'm here.
Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, in the original movie, she's really impressive. And she says, you're a disgrace to the powers of evil, and she calls upon all the powers of hell. And that's not who we saw that's not who appeared in the Maleficent movie. Any more than the majesty and impressiveness of Darth Vader was shown in any way in the whiny guy they got to play him in the in the version when he was young. And not that people don't change, but that in those cases, by doing what they were calling making those guys sympathetic, they took away the virtues of the characters. They may have taken away, they may have muted off their vices, but they also took away their virtues. They basically just made a new character, which is not the same as showing something about a guy the way he is and making you suddenly feel sympathetic for him.
Okay. That makes sense.
I'll give you a counterexample in the comics are hard to discuss because they have many origins, but in the version of the Doctor Doom, in the version where Doctor Doom burnt his face off in college because he was trying to rescue his mother from hell, instead of the version where he was just doing a scientific experiment, that makes you more sympathetic to him. That his mother had been captured by a demon and he was trying to get her back. But they didn't change how he acted. They didn't change his personality. They didn't change the way he interacted with the world. They didn't make him into a wuss. They just made they just made his backstory slightly more complicated so that you went, oh, well, yeah, I can see why I might, if that happened to me, feel this was the right thing to do, even though I don't think I would do that, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. So something more subtle than Lex Luthor getting a lifelong grudge against Superman because he made him go bald, which is apparently the original origin story.
Exactly. Though, I mean, that's kind of funny, and you have some sympathy for him being annoyed, but you kind of feel like he went over the top.
Just a smidgy bit. Just a little. Just a bit.
Tiny bit.
Just a little bit. Madness.
Yeah, the real proper villains have to have their original virtues, original strengths, sort of mutated into something more malevolent. The corrupted good is the greatest evil, isn't it?
Yes.
the
And
stronger
I
and
think,
better you were at the start is how much more damaging you can be when you turn.
right, I think there's also a big difference between Maleficent, where in order to show her as sympathetic, they had to take a very good man, the kind king from the original, and turn him into an evil guy, which is just, in my mind, a despicable thing to do to begin with. Rather, compared with, let's say, Gru from Despicable Me, he starts out as a bad man, and his love for the little girls that he ends up adopting helps him transform into a better man. Maybe not, a great one yet, but better than he was before. And I think there's a... Hey
Hey,
there.
John.
I think I was discussing the difference between trying to make a villain sympathetic by taking away the villain's virtue, such as in Maleficent or Darth Vader in the early movies, the later early movies, versus something like Gru, where the guy still has his virtues and vices, but his love for the little girls transform him into something better than he was. But they haven't taken away his whatever it was that made him what he was to begin with. And then I was talking about Doctor Doom, but that's really you know more about that. So I'm going to turn Doctor Doom over to you.
Well, my theory. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. My theory is that in order for anything to be dramatic, you have to have a tension between fallen human nature and the code you're trying to live by. Now, to make a good villain, to make a striking, impressive villain, he needs to have a code that is off, that is wrong according to the morality of the way the world actually works. So someone like Doctor Doom might be a person who refuses to fight children, or he refuses to shoot a man when he's down. He behaves according to a strict honor code, but he still commits horrific crimes. He's an impressive villain. He's a good villain. Someone like Gru. Well, let me back up another step. A villain who lacks all virtue, who's both cowardly and dishonest and not brave and not dramatic, is nothing, is no villain at all.
Yeah, he's just...
If you read Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is impressive, brave, wise. He has all the virtues except for he has no love of God. Okay? Satan is actually almost, in Milton, is actually almost a pagan paragon of all the heroic qualities that Achilles or Agamemnon or Ulysses might have. He can't hurt the invulnerable god, but he manages to outsmart God's disgusting little pets humanity, whom he then tricks into destroying themselves. The only reason why we're not rooting for him is because we're human beings. But also because Milton has a more advanced, a more wise idea of heroism than the pagans do. The pagan hero is a sad character. Achilles is going to die. He's going to go to hell and be in a condition that he himself says is worse than being the slave of a hardscrabble dirt farmer. The pagan hero was a sacrifice. The Christian knight, on the other hand, while he committed acts of sacrifice, he also gained the greater good. He eventually got the Holy Grail, at least if he's Galahad. I'm getting a little far afield, but I'm trying to make a point here.
No, it's okay.
I have a question.
A villain who is like a black knight, an evil knight who still abides by some of the code.
Which is what's so cool about Darth Vader in the original Darth Vader.
Yes, Darth Vader is in fact a black knight of space.
He works for a king. He has a code of honor. He follows a religion. He's not just a guy out there by himself as a loose cannon.
Yeah, I don't know if he has a code of honor, but he does have a code of obedience. You see him kneel to the giant image of the evil emperor and stuff. But drama requires tension between the way the guy wants to act and the way his code tells him to act. If it's a villain, he's going to have a villainous code. He's going to have a pirate code, which may be more like pirate suggestions, but still. If he's a total wretch like Gollum, the only dramatic tension there for a total wretch like Gollum is if he still has a smegel, if he still has a good part of his heart that's fighting against evil in him, which is winning and is going to win. Now, all this is to one side. To the other side is the idea of the anti-hero is where someone is trying to write as if the code is the bad guy, and the only tension is between a guy giving in to his worst impulses, which when books like that are portrayed as good things, and the guy fighting against what is rejected as an illusionary code, a code of obedience to something he shouldn't be obeying in the first place. So those guys are neither good as heroes nor as villains. They're just kind of boring.
Can you think of any villains of the? I mean, before earlier when we were preparing, Jason also mentioned Mingamongo, who I know is also a favorite of yours.
Favorite of mine, yeah.
And if you think of these villains like Mingamongo, Fu Manchu, Darth Vader, Satan, or in Paradise Lost, is Paradise Lost the first one? Can you think of a single impressive villain from before that?
Yes, it goes all the way back to the beginning. In when Homer was telling the story of the war.
Homer has no villains. There are no villains in Homer. Homer's told from two sides. Neither Achilles nor Hector are shown as the bad guy. It's more like he takes the camera and shows both sides of the fight.
That's the same thing, though.
No, it's not. Nobody there is like Darth Vader. It's more like we're two noble people who end up fighting each other, and how sad, how sorrowful it is that these noble guys are at each other's throat. There isn't somebody like Mingamongo in the Iliad.
Yeah, because Mingamongo would be struck down for his hubris by the gods. The pagans really do have a melancholy, really do have a sad kind of world.
The only villain, as opposed to like a law of nature, a guy who's just like another human being, a guy who's just despicable, like he feeds his kids to the gods or something. The only villain I can think of from before Milton is in the Norse mythology. Utgard Loki is kind of impressive in his trickery, and Loki goes from being a good guy to a bad guy.
Well, but there's also the Cyclops. Isn't he a villain? I feel a little sorry for him.
Hey, Ben, can you speak up for something? We're kind of getting static.
No, I can.
There you go.
I'm here. Is there a problem? I can't hear anything. Any problems?
We're getting a lot of.
Well,
Diana.
Hang on, maybe it's me. Let me switch to headphones.
No,
Someone's mic is picking up their speakers. I thought it was Josh.
No, it was Ben's picture that was flashing when I heard an odd noise. I thought he was trying to talk and I wasn't hearing him.
Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyway, back to the subject.
Yes. Oh, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do I want to reveal this? I'm a big fan of the Punisher. I quite like him as a character.
Sure.
What's he?
I think he's on that line towards. Well, he's clearly in the anti-hero department, right? Because he's not just a bad guy, but he's not really a good guy. And I always think of him as one of the archetypical anti-heroes from when anti-heroes suddenly became popular in the comics, and at one point he was like the only one. So it wasn't everybody was that way. He was cool because he was the guy who was that way.
He's based on a character from a series of men's novels. His name I can't remember. He was originally simply a villain because he was a vigilante, but he became a hero because in the 80s America's moral decline made his behavior heroic when before it would have been completely unacceptable. He is not an anti-hero in the specific sense that I was using the word, but I was using the word in a technical sense to mean someone who disobeys the code. What he is a once again I have to back up and do a little setup.
That's okay.
When you're fighting between heroes and villains in the country, in the wilderness, in the Old West, the marshal wore a white hat and the cattle rustler wore a black hat, and they met at high noon in the bright sunlight on the street when everyone else was behind the windows and shot at each other. Okay, because when you did villainy in the country, all your neighbors knew you. You basically lived in each other's pockets, and everyone in a village knows everyone else in the village. When you move to the big city, suddenly any villain can escape into the crowd by turning a corner. All he has to do is step into the crowded subway, and you can't find him again. So the heroes in those have to be hunters. They have to be detectives. But after World War II, the morality in America became a little more uncertain of itself, and the notion started that you could not have the white hats fight the black hats because the white hats were too good to do the hard and terrible work necessary to find and kill the Black Hats. The work itself was too dirty, so you had to find people who were gray hats, people who were like Sam Spade, and I use him, not Philip Marlowe as the example, because Philip Marlowe is actually a stand-up guy. Sam Spade is not. Wait, excuse me, I might be getting those two backwards.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Sam Spade's
Phil
the guy from
Marlowe's the
Monty
kind of noble guy, and Sam Spade's the guy who's kind of a bit.
Yeah, he's a bit on the
under
edge.
the-
Well, the Punisher is the same way. The Punisher is gray. He himself is driven by internal demons to do acts that are immoral, wrong, but he tries to use the wrong to fight wrong. He tries to use fire to fight fire. He's an anti-hero the way most people normally use the word, meaning a hero who is not admirable. A hero who he still has a bit of a code, he has some remnants of it, but his code has been shattered or broken, probably by the war, Now, what's interesting to me is what makes the Punisher different from the Batman. The Batman's family was also killed by criminals. He also dresses in a big black cloak, like the Shadow. There's a number of heroes going all the way back, at least back to the 20s, who dress and act like villains. Zorro dresses in black. He wears a black hat. He wears a mask. The Lone Ranger wears a mask. These guys all have the attributes of villainy, and yet they use the villainy for heroic ends. They fight fire with fire. But there's something about the Batman that makes him clearly more heroic than the Punisher. The Punisher's shtick, his whole approach is that he's a little too on the edge, a little too bitter, a little too dark himself. That he's a devil fighting other devils. Am I right?
I think there's a big difference between a devil fighting other devils and Zorro or Batman. One of these guys who's supposed to be a noble, good guy who's been maligned in a corrupt world, who has no way to do good except to pretend he's a villain. If you understand what I'm saying. I think those two guys are almost opposites to each other.
Well, the Shadow didn't pretend he was a villain, but the Green Hornet did, and he set up sting operations. If you ever listen to the original radio plays from way back in the day. But the Shadow did use the terror of crime against the criminals. The terror of striking from the dark, the terror of being unseen. And the Batman, of course, quite deliberately dresses like a bat because criminals are cowardly and superstitious lot. These are angels of vengeance. They're the angel of death. They're trying to terrify the corrupt Egyptians, if you will, the corrupt world into being good. They're trying to put the fear of God into people. I don't mean that literally. I don't think Batman thinks about the fear of God, but he does dress up like a bat in order to scare people, scare bad people.
Because criminals are
Cowardly and superstitious lot.
exactly.
Right.
Well, I was going to say, the Punisher does have a very strong, well, I don't know, at least in all of the Punisher comics I've read, mostly the more recent stuff, he does actually have a fairly strong code. Like, I mean, a very, very rigorous code. There's been more than a couple of storylines in some of the movies and in the comics where he'll go to ridiculous lengths not to harm what he considers an innocent person. So, police
suspect that he's
military
kind of-
totally off limits, civilians totally off limits, and where he thinks he has, he's like considering killing himself and things like that because he's failed so spectacularly to live up to
I
his
suspect
code.
he's morphed over the years. You know, that the more you have a guy as a hero, the more you have to kind of show him having certain heroic qualities, even if he has these villainous qualities too.
Yeah, but consider that Doctor Doom also would not necessarily kill an innocent
That's true,
bystander.
but they don't show Doctor Doom as he's not the hero of his comic. It's not the Doctor Doom comic.
No, and
know
the
that
Punisher.
he kills people for not being happy in Latveria. So.
Yes, that's true. But the Punisher is at war, so he has rules of engagement that he abides by, including minimizing civilian casualties.
Well, it's not even minimizing. He won't. Like, he'll let the bad guy get away rather than harm an innocent.
But do you agree with me that he's still a darker figure than the Batman? Batman won't even carry a gun.
Oh yeah. But I mean, I guess.
But I'm trying to put my finger on what the difference is, because I think of the Punisher as the typical anti-hero, the typical once again, I don't mean anti-hero the way I was using the word before. I mean the dark gray hero who does the evil deeds to stop evil. That's a very cynical, a very bitter character, a very bitter figure.
Okay.
Whereas the Batman is more like the Angel of Vengeance. He actually has he actually is working for the side of the good guys. And I think now that's just me. I see. I'm not as familiar with the characters as maybe I should be. I think of the Batman as like the Angel of Death, like the guy, the executioner who works for the king, the torturer who works for the king. Whereas the Punisher is a devil fighting other devils, but a devil who's got an honor code, a devil who has to abide by an iron code. He lives for vengeance.
Well, one other thing I liked about Christopher Nolan's treatment of Batman in Batman Begins was his desire to be a symbol, deliberately, to inspire others, to demonstrate to the world, not just to the criminals, how cowardly and how defeatable they are, that their hope is not lost.
Now that is an excellent point, because even back in the original, when I was talking about the pagan world where heroes were sacrificed to Hera, a sacrifice to a god was always a public event. It always had a symbolic nature. That's a very good point. And that might be the difference. I'm sure Frank Castle doesn't intend to. Hello?
Yeah.
I'm sure Frank Castle doesn't intend anyone to follow his to inspire anyone. He just wants to kill. He just wants to kill the crime families.
Yes.
Yeah, he's just about that, to punish the guilty, whereas Batman is more about healing the community, helping it to stand up for itself.
I would ask the question: isn't the Punisher more effective than Batman? I mean, like the Punisher.
How do you judge effectiveness of a comic book character?
I suppose. How many people has the Joker killed, and how long would the Joker have lasted if the Punisher had gotten into him? How many people would the Joker have killed if the Punisher had a go at him?
I have to object because, of course, the Shadow on whom Batman is based almost never let anyone escape because, of course, unlike the Batman, he carried 245 automatics and just drilled them. And the weed of crime bears bitter fruit was the tagline from the radio play, but the bitter fruit was death. Okay, crime does not pay. The Batman, it comes from a gentler time and has to throw a batarang. The Punisher uses bullets. That's just a difference of the genre.
Oh, that's true. But I mean, the Joker's killed a lot of people.
Batman's The Dark Knight, he does kill bad guys and they don't get up again. But killing off the Joker's like killing off Shiwan Khan or killing off Fu Manchu. Even if even if the writer wants to kill them off, the next editor with the storyline will say, "Hey, let's bring him back from the dead as a robot or something because he's so popular." He even came back in Batman Beyond in the TV show, the Joker. I mean, he got resurrected as Tim Drake or something. Sorry, I should have spoiler alerted that one.
I guess you can't kill. I guess you can't kill the Joker. He's sort of an arch villain of the story, whereas everyone the Punisher kills, they're kind of expendable.
And let me ask you the pointed counter question: name anyone from Frank Castle's Rogues Gallery. Name me a villain from the Punisher. Yeah, exactly.
No. Jigsaw.
Okay.
No, I just had to remember the character's name.
Is he dead, or is he going to come back?
No, he keeps escaping. That's true. Fair enough. Yeah, I get it. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, the Punisher doesn't have a lot of long.
The Batman and the Spider-Man, I think, have the best rogues gallery of any heroes in comic book land. Yeah, mostly because the Batman's characters are just crazy. They're just people who dress like penguins and stuff, carry umbrellas, or dress like slinky cats.
Well, I'm going to be. Sorry. I was going to say I'm going to be very interested to see how the second season of Daredevil goes that they're making for Netflix, because apparently the Punisher's coming in that. I'm all excited. I like it.
Daredevil, the Netflix version of Daredevil, they made quite dark, and they made him quite. And of course, I as a Catholic appreciate it because the whole Catholic guilt trip thing is I think a much more interesting way of dealing with the tension between being a gray hat and being the gray fighting the dark. He in fact is dressed as a devil to go fight the other devils. You know.
But there's been lots of storylines in the comics over the years where Daredevil and the Punisher have interacted, and Matt Murdock is like, no, you bring them to justice and you punish them, you
Right, with the system.
take them to
He believes in the
trial.
justice. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's like that, and the Punisher's like, don't be a childish idiot. You kill them.
Yeah.
You punish them so they can't hurt anyone else's family.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the difference between the two. And the Punisher is always he won't
He
hurt.
isn't really a Punisher, isn't he? He's really an executioner.
He won't hurt Matt. Well, he won't kill Matt Murdock because he's a good guy. But he gets really frustrated with him because he keeps getting in the way.
Well, the
because he
fine
won't
line-
let him do his job.
the fine
Well,
line is
isn't that
the
probably
fine line
the-
is justice and
I mean-
vengeance. That's the difference between the characters. That's why Daredevil's a hero and Frank Castle's a vigilante.
Well, I mean, and isn't it a lot like the difference between, private eyes and vigilantes versus the police? Where in real life, they get in each other's way too. You know what I mean?
That's true. Oh, actually, did anyone ever see the TV show The Shield?
No, I never saw it.
With Frank Mackey, and he's like runs a team of a special team on the police force for drug enforcement and stuff, and he's he's relatively corrupt. Well, he's sort of corrupt in the sense that he's friends with the drug dealers, some of the drug dealers, and he takes kickbacks from them. But he tolerates their presence as long as they don't deal near schools, and he's sort of an interest. He gets really corrupt and evil by the end, and it's sort of the whole series is his descent into just
Right.
being corrupted by
His code
does.
is fighting his human nature, and it's human nature that says, be realistic, be cynical, don't be a baby, kill the bad guys, make a deal with the evil, throw the child off the sleigh so the wolves eat him first, make a practical decision. And the real drama is that once you make a practical decision, practical decisions become darker and darker and darker. And that was the process. I've never seen the show, but I can tell if it was a dramatic show, as dramatic as you said, the drama is each step the guy has to decide whether to go sink further into hell or take a step in the other direction, take a step toward heaven, and do the harder thing and believe in this invisible code of honor that no one can see.
Oh, it ends. It's a horrible ending. It's quite a good ending, but it's just like.
Sure.
But in the very first episode, he gets a new member assigned to his team, and that turns out to be. So he's basically being investigated, and he murders the guy basically, and makes it look like a gang shooting gone bad, or like a what do you call it? Like a raid gone bad, and it's like it sort of sets the tone for the whole series. But
sure, it's a tragedy because his own evil is going to end up destroying him.
Yeah.
That's what a tragedy is. That's what you're supposed to show if you actually believe in the code. Some modern writers try to make tragedies meaningless, where some other thing destroys the bad guy instead of his own evil. But that's the whole point of trying to tell the story that way. And I haven't seen the show, so I don't know which it is. I don't know if it's a modern show that is trying to side with the voices of cynicism and saying there is no code.
I suspect it probably is.
But if he gets tripped by the evil things that he himself sets in motion, it still might be the other way, the old-fashioned way. And what's odd and what's amusing about the whole thing is that there's lots of stories where you can't tell which way the writer has in mind. Even after the end, you go, I'm not sure if he actually, when Sam Spade turns the girl he's in love with over to the cops, is he just doing that for cynical reasons, or does he actually believe in the code of honor that he in the final
that he's supposed to be upholding?
Says to the girl, when your partner gets shot, you got to do something. And this is a partner who he was diddling the guy's wife. he was one of the murder suspects. It was a guy he hated. Okay. So
but I think the point of that is that he did have a code, and that in the end he did live up to the code of his
I would
Even
think
though
so,
he was
too.
kind of a shady guy in a shady business, the
I would think so,
business
too.
was of trying to uphold the law, and in the end he does.
Once again, I would agree, but I could see how someone sitting next to me in the audience might think that Sam Spade was fibbing to the girl at the end, and that the world is just a dismal place and there is no code, and that's the way a modern person would write the story, because modern people don't believe in the code. They're nihilists. They believe in nothing.
On a
But
slightly different,
I
slightly
agree.
earlier.
I think that one does uphold the code.
Can you tell good hero and villain stories if you don't believe in anything?
No, there's no
No,
drama.
I don't think so.
Because then there's no tension between the higher calling and the lower, nor is there the drama of Lucifer's defiance of a brightness that he can't stand, that he can't tolerate. There's nothing. There's one appetite fighting another appetite.
You may
You
or
have
may
one,
not be able to write a good action sequence,
but you won't care.
and have
No,
an
you can't.
interesting action sequence where two bad guys, two guys who don't really stand for anything, come up against each other. But I don't know.
Agree.
A lot
I
of what
completely
makes
agree.
characters enduring. We were just had a discussion this week about.
If it's a fight between two guys, both of whom I wish die, I sit there and I go, why can't they both lose? Especially if they have no redeeming
No,
characters.
you misunderstand what I'm saying. The
They're not even
author
brave.
might be able to write a really good action sequence. He might be good at it. But I'm talking about just the action sequence. Let's just put 5 action sequences up against each other.
Right.
But once you get into the whole story, the reason why they're there, the purposes, the outcome, I don't think you can write a story that is gripping and memorable. You might be able to write a story that is popular for a short period of time because there's something about it that amuses some group of people. But as times change and people's ideas change, I don't think you can keep it.
Yeah,
I'm
the
thinking
good story has to have a purpose to it, and you can't get an ought from an is, as the philosopher said,
Right.
which one it was. So if you don't believe in anything, you can't get to that ought, you can't get to that purpose, you can't get to that goal. So without goals, you can't have a story.
We were talking this week about One Piece, which may be the best piece of writing in the universe. we just reached episode 400.
Take that, Shakespeare.
We reached episode 400, and the guy waits until episode 400 to put certain basic. I'm not talking about language. I'm talking about the depth of characters and cleverness. But what I liked about the show, one of many, many things, is that every character who joins the pirate crew has a vast goal. They want to be the best at something, or they want to do something really difficult. And you automatically get a lot of drama and interest that just lifts the story when your characters have purpose to them.
What's the show?
One Piece. It's a Japanese show that the figures
All right.
are extremely bizarre looking, to the degree that I'll watch it for a while and I'll get used to it, and then a new character will come on stage and I'll go, "That's so freaky!" And then I'll get used to that guy and I'll be used to it for a while, and something else will come on stage and I'll go, "That's so freaky!" But the guy it has tremendous heart and really excellent storytelling. He never forgets anything. He's really good at setting the scope. He's really good at setting up what's coming, so that when you get there, he's good at setting his characters so that every single character has something they do and they all get their own scenes. He never forgets them or forgets what's going on. And then they have dramatic battles that are cleverly done, and then they have really good finishing to their arcs, So the whole thing is just utterly delightful. And as I said, we just reached episode 400, and only in episode 400 do you find out something basic about the whole setup that kind of changes the way you see everything. And I'm just tremendously impressed with the guy's patience, that he's going to write a story that's going to take him like 20 years to tell. And it's based on a manga, and it's an anime.
The premise of the story is that in this world is just entering the great age of exploration. They have gunpowder, sword fights, and they have piracy. And
but they also have some what we would call magic.
There are things called devil fruits that if you eat them, you get one particular magical or supernatural power. And so it's like a superhero story where every one of the superheroes has a different power or
The main
ability.
character has the
Mr. Fantastic power. He's got
Mr.
the
Fantastic stretching power, but he
Right.
uses it in a very different way.
Yeah.
And he wants to be king of the pirates, and he is a young idealistic boy who doesn't use the word pirate to mean anything I would use by the word pirate, except that they do resist the corrupt government. But you know, he's very noble and very silly at the same time, and the
whole
storytelling is just excellent,
the whole
and the
story.
villains are well done, and which brings me to a point that goes beyond just One Piece. One thing I really enjoy in many Japanese anime, I think of the Kenshin and quite a few. They set up excellent villains, and if the villain is not actually despicable, often the hero wins him over, and the guy becomes either a friend or a grudgingly respectable villain who will let him go because of his nobility or things like that. And I really enjoy seeing the progress as you see these characters whose spirit and heroism and nobility win over the world around them, so that as they continue they have more and more allies. I just think it's a very clever and interesting way of telling a story.
What's funny is I myself think the Japanese and the English have a lot in common in their cultures. I'm not sure why. Maybe something about being an island nation. But Robin Hood, the famous thief,
It's true.
who's also
He
a
does
hero,
the same thing.
does the same thing. He beats up Little John and he gets beaten up by Little John when they fight with quarterstaffs at the ford, and same thing with Friar Tuck, and he wins them over. He wins them over to his side.
Yeah, that's very true. It's a very clever way to tell a story, because you can make your villains as dramatic as possible, and if people like them, you can kind of keep them around. And in a number of these shows, I'm thinking particularly of Ronin Kenshin and of One Piece, the main characters, his unwillingness to give up is one of his best qualities. Just his, and it's even more true in Bleach, though Bleach it's almost too much so, I would think. But it can list a lot of anime, and they just do it really. The anime storytelling, I'm always really impressed with it. They set up with fun at the beginning. They show you the backstory at the point where it becomes revelation, and you really want to know about it rather than boring you with it. And they do these wonderful things where you either destroy your villains or you win them over, and they kind of become your friends.
The dog doesn't like that comment. Hey, Joshi, back up a second and tell the dog and any other listeners what you mean by revelation as opposed to backstory, because that's an important.
This is something that I've noticed because of anime. Backstory is everything that happened before the page one, whether it's shot one on your movie, page one in your book, or your comic, and often backstory is very difficult to put on stage because the flashbacks tend to bore the readers. The reader's eyes glaze over, so you're trying to get all this information about your character on stage, and the reader doesn't want to read it. But if you hold off and you merely get the readers or the viewers hooked on your character initially, your viewer / reader, then your audience, wants to know about the character now. They're really curious, where'd this guy come from? Why is this guy the way he is? And suddenly the same information that would have bored them to tears if you'd put it on earlier becomes long-awaited revelation that they're dying to find out, And now they're really interested. Oh, tell me more about, what happened in year 3, because now it seems significant. It's giving them a new look at something they like. And I think one of our as writers, one of our jobs is to try to find that point where our information becomes desired revelation rather than boring backstory.
That, by the way, was one of the flaws with the Shadow movie, which came out a few years ago, which I assume no one saw but me because it was not that good. In the original books and in the radio plays, no origin story is ever given for the Shadow. No one knows who he is or why he's gunning down criminals or dressing all in black and has the power to cloud men's minds. In the movie, they put on his backstory immediately in the first 5 minutes, thus
Yeah,
robbing
and
the
it
character
took
of
away a
all,
lot.
robbing the character of all mystery, of all drama, of all magnitude, and so on and so forth. He was just a guy from a Tibet who had psychic powers that he could use to make himself invisible, and it was a poorly done decision. It was poorly executed.
Yeah, I actually did see that.
Did you like it?
I haven't.
I thought it was a bit lame, that origin story myself.
Yeah.
Ma-
Long
The
time ago.
visuals were perfect, though. The look
Yeah.
of everything was really good.
Those people we know who were Shadow fans really did not like the movie. Those people we know who were not Shadow fans but are just genre fans enjoyed it. They didn't seem to be as bothered by it as the. I think the fans knew it could have been much better, while the people who weren't fans were like, "Oh, this is an okay movie."
That's true of any movie. If you read the book first, you're going to be disappointed in the movie. Even
No,
something
it's
like
not true of any movie. Some movies are
Good.
actually bad,
I like
as
The
opposed
Martian,
to being bad
and I
because
read the
they.
book first.
Well, The
I
Martian
did
was
too.
really good. We just saw that.
Yeah,
I did
it was
too.
fantastic. Sorry.
I did too, but the only people I heard making negative comments about the movie, and they were very small comments, very nitpicky comments, were people who had just read the book. I'd read the book when it first came out, and I was really pleased with the book, and I was sure the movie could not make it very well, but the movie really did. And now, let me draw it back into our conversation. There's a story. There's no villains in that piece. Is there any
Yeah.
bad guy in that piece?
No,
The planet?
it's just
Mars is the bad guy.
Yeah. The God of
nature
War is the bad
adversary.
guy. They've got a deity at now. I'm kidding.
But the nature is the adversary, unless you think it was Ares himself coming to revenge his planet. But the heroism of the main character, who's just kind of an ordinary guy in many ways, is his cleverness.
Right. He's going to science the heck out of things.
Yeah.
And that's why it's science fiction. I really like that show. And this leads me to my next question. In a fantasy story and a science fiction story, are the heroes different in any fundamental way? And I think that they are, because to be a science fiction story, doesn't the hero have to use science to solve the problem? I'm posing that as a question because science fiction.
I would say technically, science fiction nowadays is a very broad thing, which includes, all sorts of everything from space opera that could just be romance in space. But originally, science fiction was, in fact, stories where science solved the problem. I think one reason so many people
between science and fantasy, with fantasy to one side and science to the other. Let me rephrase the question and just say: closer you get to the science side of things, doesn't the hero have to have the intellectual power, courage, and heroism to solve the problem through science?
I will put it the other way and say I think the reason The Martian was so popular was that it was real science fiction. It was straight out old-fashioned science fiction done really. It was Robinson Crusoe in space done really well and cleverly.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question. On your science fiction versus fantasy, where's Star Wars?
Star Wars is science fantasy.
Science
Star Wars
fantasy.
is space opera. Space opera is my genre. In my genre, what you do is you tell a fantasy story, but you give it the trappings, the sets, and the props of science fiction, but you don't actually do any real science fiction in it.
Okay, so Star Trek, and where's Star Trek?
The hero in Star Wars triumphs because he's the chosen one, and that's a fantasy trophy. He triumphs because of his moral goodness, not because he solves the problem intellectually.
Star Trek is closer to science fiction, though. It had a lot of science fiction ideas in it.
Well,
that came
only if you watch it believing Spock is the hero, which is my take on Star Trek.
No. I mean, let's go back just to original Star Trek.
No, it's clearly science fiction.
I've read many references to biographies of modern scientists who said Star Trek was what inspired them. The sliding doors that are everywhere now were new on Star Trek. The little communicators. I mean, look at all the just straight out science that was in that. Star Wars has a lot of things that have no science to them at all. They're just nifty things. Star Trek had lots and lots of science, even just, aliens and or having a silicon life form or thing. They had a lot of science fiction ideas, even if they had other things.
Star Trek is science fiction. Star Wars is also science fiction because they got spaceships in it, but it's in the part of this giant, vast science fiction mansion. It's in the East Wing, which is where
It's in the science fantasy overlap more than Star Trek, which is, I think, just
Space
science
opera.
fiction.
Star Trek is now space opera. Space opera has three characteristics. One is gigantism. Everything takes place on a huge scale. The second is simplicity. The villains are absolutely villainous, and the heroes are absolutely heroic. Okay, I actually think the extended universe does some disadvantage to Star Trek.
Star Wars.
Star Wars. If the Empire is not simply the evil Empire, the simplicity of it is what gives it a lot of its character. And the other is it uses fantasy tropes in a scientific background. When John Carter, Warlord of Mars, is teleported to Mars, he's basically the same as a seaman who was washed ashore on the coast of Africa and has to fight the savages to become the king of the tribe and rescue the princess. Those are fantasy tropes.
Okay.
But all the scientific information in Edgar Rice Burroughs was accurate for the time when he wrote. I just reread this story to my kids, and I was rather surprised at how actual hardcore scientific it was. It's normally thought of as just being a mere adventure story that takes place on Mars, but he actually thought some things through and came up with some very clever ideas. One of which was a contemplation of what happens when a planet ages, which was, and I should say, the astronomers at the day and age thought that Venus was a younger planet, Earth was a present planet, and Mars was going to be what we were going to turn into in the future. And so the speculation that there was an older race there that had evolved past us and was now dying out was a completely legitimate scientific speculation for the time. And what Edgar Rice Burroughs said was that the savages became savage because they practiced communism. They lay eggs and they raise their children in common, and that makes them so they have no family loyalties, no love and affection. And that's actually the point of the story of A Princess of Mars, which is actually a rather subtle point if you think about it, a rather profound one too. Love is what makes civilization, is what he said.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm sorry that I killed everything with my comment about Princess of Mars.
So back to some of David's original questions, because we talked about this a little bit at one point, John, when you weren't here.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about, he was talking about the modern trend of making sympathetic villains. I thought he meant things like what they were trying to do with the Maleficent movie.
Oh yeah, he did.
Which I defined as changing the character to
Sorry,
take
I'm back.
away their virtues. And I was just wondering if we might want to talk just a little bit more about that, because that is a trend now where you try to make a villain. I mean, I guess isn't Wicked one of the first things it did? I haven't actually read Wicked, but I think you did. Isn't it?
I read as much of Wicked as I could stand, and then when I realized that the guy was just playing a stupid trick on me, where he was trying to make the good guys into the bad guys and the bad guys into the good guys, I got bored and put it aside. Now, I'd seen that thing done well when Alan Moore did it in Watchmen. He makes the good guys the bad guys and the bad guys the good guys quite cleverly. So to see a guy do it stupidly didn't impress me. And since I myself think the good guys are good guys and bad guys are bad guys for a reason, the actual moral of the story didn't have a sufficient appeal to me to retain my interest once I'd seen the trick being done clumsily. It's one thing to look at a magician doing a trick. It's another thing to look at a magician doing a trick when you can see through the trick and you can see the card up his sleeve. In this case, as I said in my opening statements, I thought that the difference between an anti-hero and this is an anti-hero is a guy who breaks the code, his moral code, in order to get at the bad guys. He turns himself into a devil to fight other devils. But there's still a difference between a devil and an angel. These stories go, well, angels and devils are all just the same, and you think he's an angel, but the handsome prince is actually a cad, and the villain is actually the victim, and I'm a victim, and you're a victim, and there's all victims, and I'm thinking, the reason why I put down the book Wicked is because there was no drama in it. The Wicked Witch wasn't out to get anything or do anything I cared about. The villainous Wizard of Oz who was experimenting on animals or harming vegetarians or something stupid was not up to anything. He wasn't Fu Manchu trying to conquer the world.
It's similar to the thing I keep talking about.
He was the guy running the secret police of Oz. Now, can you imagine a stupider idea than, oh, the Munchkin Secret Police, Bach is going to get you.
Challenge accepted.
Come on.
That reminds me of the whole. I'm planning on writing an article calling something like "Defending the Wood Perilous" about this and Once Upon a Time and Fables and Into the Woods and dozens of other things out there where they take fairy tale concepts, and really when you get down to it, Oz has the same qualities of the fairy tales and is for what I was thinking about, and try to turn them into worldly things. And it doesn't work very well because the whole point of the Wood Perilous, of fairyland, is that you can't tell what a thing is by looking at it because it can change, but inside, morally, it's very distinct. Fairyland is a place where the physical world changes, but the moral world doesn't. The prince is always the noble prince, and the evil queen is always evil, even if she's beautiful on the outside. And when you meet an old lady, she might be an evil queen, witch, or she might be a good witch, but once you find out, that's what she is. And when they take these things and they try to make them like modern things and make them gray and make them like the anti-hero stuff we were talking about,
like the decadence one.
They take away everything that made it a fairy tale. The only version I can think of somebody bringing a fairy tale to the real world that struck me as being, in the correct vein was Disney's Enchanted, where the girl comes out of the cartoon and then she acts exactly like a princess from a cartoon would act, even though, of course, in modern New York or wherever she is, it's kind of silly.
Sure. And mixed into it, but they made that in. But that's the comedy then.
Sure, but it was charming. It was fun.
Yes, it was. I agree.
I would love to see somebody write a better story. What starts happening is you begin to realize that the person has just taken the name of something you like and maybe the face of it and is demeaning it. They've just taken, the name of the characters of Oz, or they've taken the name of your favorite fairy tale characters or something like that, and they've turned them into something that's unrelated in any way to what it actually was, except for the name, and then they have it go do something the original would never do, and they go, look what it does, Look how evil the Wizard of Oz is. Well, no, the Wizard of Oz never was that guy.
I'm reminded of how Alan Moore took The Question and turned him into Rorschach, and then had him go off and do stuff that was insane that The Question would never do. The Question was originally a Steve Ditko character who stood for the rather rigid black and white Ayn Randian code called objectivism. And the Rorschach was supposed to be Alan Moore's takeoff on that, showing the insanity of believing in black and white and the insanity of believing in good and evil. But oddly enough, Rorschach turns out to be his most popular character, and Alan Moore can't understand it.
It's funny because while I was talking, what I was seeing in my mind was Lost Girls by Alan Moore, where he took Alice and Dorothy and Wendy Darling and turned them into sex bunnies. And, of course, they had nothing in common with those characters anymore. Not that girls can't grow up and be different than when they're girls, but
But drawing a mustache on the Mona Lisa.
Fan fiction. All these things are just fan fiction. Fan fiction does not live up to regular fiction because the people take the characters. Fan fiction is usually written by someone who likes the story but isn't a writer. They haven't put much time into writing. So let's say they're a Harry Potter fan, and they love it. They want to hear more about Harry Potter, which is great. I am too. I think that's a great thing. So they sit and they write, and so I was reading a bit over a friend's shoulder, and Harry Potter's making these snarky passes at Hermione. And I said, there's nothing in this scene, not a single character in this scene says anything that a character I know from Harry Potter would ever say. They're not the lines these characters would say. But what's going on in the mind of the fan or fic writer is they're seeing the original characters, and then they want to have the characters have some kind of romantic adventure or something. And they don't realize that they've lost the original character, that all they really have, if you change the names, you would never know those were Harry and Hermione. If Rowling wrote a character, a scene, and she used different names because they were in disguise, the average reader would be able to tell which one was Hermione and which one was Harry. And it's because they've lost the character. And that's what seems to me to be going on in a lot of these things where they take these characters, you know, in Maleficent we mentioned earlier is a good example, and then they just turn them into something that's not the original character at all, and then they act as if they've proven something. We've proven that, you know, King Stephen is bad and Maleficent is good because we had two people who are nothing like them do something.
They're trying to prove that there is no such thing as good and bad. See, they're not writing fan fiction. Their fan fiction is too good for them. They're writing anti-fan fiction. They're in the same position as the guy who made the Starship Troopers movies stands to Bob Heinlein, who wrote the Starship Trooper book. They're people who hate the original because the original establishes a moral code of good and evil that offends them, that offends that convicts them.
They are attempting to...
They're attempting to delegitimize the court of law that has convicted them, but that court of law exists only in their own conscience.
Yeah, instead of fan fiction, it's heckler fiction.
What they're trying to do is... I'm sorry, say again?
Instead of fan fiction, it's heckler fiction.
Yes, excellent. It's heckler
fiction. It's excellently put.
Excellent.
It's exactly. And they're trying to say evil is good and good is evil, but they don't want to come out and say, I believe these things. They want to take the things you hold sacred and demean them so that you see that the thing you held sacred is demeaned. That's what they're trying to do.
Stephen Sondheim's Into the Wood, which was also cleverly done, is heckler fiction.
Which I hated.
Yeah, as you should. Because it hates you. You know, it takes Prince Charming and turns him into a cad. I'm sorry, Prince Charming is a guy who sacrifices everything to get the princess. He's not a cad at all. He's the guy who puts the shoe on the slipper of the servant girl and turns her into a queen. He's a Christ figure. He's a savior. And you're going to sit there and mock him?
The thing that bothered me the most about Into the Wood, the first half of which I loved because I thought it was fairy tales, was the song the young man sings about there being giants in the sky. It's so beautiful and inspiring. But nothing comes of it. He doesn't achieve anything. He doesn't reach any beautiful and inspiring thing. It's not, you know, One Piece where the guy comes up off the ground where he's been, you know, completely defeated to save his friends despite that, you know, all that he's, you know, may never be able to move again or whatever. You know, it's just despicable. And yet, I see that what bothers me the most is I see many of my friends who are fantasy fairy tale fans, and they've been taken in. That's what is upsetting to me. They do like it because they are brought in by the glory of the song about the giants in the sky, and they don't see that they're allowing themselves to be demeaned by accepting the second act, which makes mockery of everything that made them enjoy that song.
All these stories are about futility, but they're always packaged as if they're stories about pragmatism, about reality, about the kind of cynical take on things where you go, well, yeah, that's nice, but it's time to grow up now.
Right, and what I don't like is the attitude that when you take all these wonderful things and you make them noir, which is what usually goes on, they're making them like Sam Spade in almost every case.
Sam Spade is a gray hat fighting a black hat. It's not a white hat fighting a black hat.
When you do that, somehow you've improved them. You've made them more for adults, you know? And when really, that often, that's not what's going on at all. You're just
the opposite.
dragging them in the mud.
It's the opposite. The attitude that everything is nothing's worth doing, and that everything's a punk, and that everything is bitter, and that everything is a loss. That's a teenager attitude. Usually a teenager who has encountered his first disappointment and hasn't yet got the calluses and toughness of a grown-up or a saint. A guy he hasn't endured any torture yet. He's disappointed because he's run out of cigarettes. The attitude, that's the reason why all these bitter, cynical things are being directed at basically teen audiences. Alan Moore did not write for grown-ups. He was writing a comic book. You know, he was writing a comic book in the day and age when comics were being read by older people because we of our generation hadn't given up on comic books like our parents did. We still wanted to read them after we were grown up. But they were pretend grown up. They were a teenager's idea of what a grown up acts like, not a grown up's idea of what a grown up acts like. A grown up acts like Socrates. A grown up acts like Christ. A grown up acts like Lao Tzu. A grown up acts like the Buddha. Those are grown up men. None of those men thought that life was not worth living.
Okay. That makes sense.
Sorry, I've killed the conversation again.
No, it's
No,
okay.
it's fine.
John Carter and Socrates both are conversation enders.
Well, there's one thing I was wanted to mention when we were talking about Batman and Joker. There's a comment on Quorum I just saw a glimpse of it, and that the reason why the Batman versus Joker is such a strong sort of archetype is that the Joker and Batman so mirror each other. That the Joker is the worst that we could become as ordinary people living in cities, and Batman is the best that we could become. And
As an
it's always
ordinary, yeah,
more-
because Batman is not a superhero, really, not in the sense of like a mutant. He's an ordinary person who is doing the best he can.
Yeah, he's dedicated himself to improving himself in order to defend others, whereas the Joker has sort of dedicated himself to bringing other people down and doing as much damage as possible.
And what's funny about those characters is they're both wearing each other's costumes. The Batman is dressed like a Halloween scare villain. He's dressed in black. He wears a black mask. The Joker's dressed in bright colors and wears a smile. And he's all the more horrifying for that. You see what I mean? Both of them are hidden. Both of them are hidden behind the opposite of what they look like.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I mean, unless you're afraid of clowns.
Yes. And who's not afraid of clowns?
Then the Joker makes perfect sense. He's terrifying.
I realize this is not directly to the subject, but I was so amused that a friend of mine was talking about clowns. Did I tell this last time? I think I may have said this in another early podcast. The thing about clowns in the middle of the night. I'll say it again. It's short. So he was trying to explain why they were having problems in France with clowns who were people dressing up as clowns and doing acts of sabotage or something. And his daughter didn't understand why anybody would be afraid of a clown. He said, well, you know, if it's the middle of the day and I see a clown talking to children carrying balloons, I'm not afraid of it. But if I'm out at 12 o'clock at night on the corner smoking a cigarette and I see a clown, it's kind of creepy. So a lot of it has to do with what the clown is doing. You know, the Joker out there with his crazy makeup in the middle of the night is a little different than, you know, your average circus clown.
Fair
And the other reason why Batman and the Joker are nice counterpoints to each other is that unlike the other villains Batman faces, the Joker has no code, has no morality, has no nothing, has nothing he's trying to get. He can't be threatened, he can't be bribed, he can't be bought off, he can't be satisfied, because the only thing he wants is to show the world as a ridiculous, deadly joke, to laugh while you're on the gallows, to make people die laughing. He doesn't stand for anything. The Joker is like the void. He's like the abyss. He's like nothing you can make sense of. He's madness. He's chaos. And the
Like the
Batman.
nothing in Never-Ending Story.
What's that?
Like the nothing in Never-Ending Story.
In fact, that's a good reference for those of the listeners who haven't heard it. In the Never-Ending Story, the antagonist is the nothingness that happens when you take the storytelling ability and turn it into a lie. And the difference between a lie and a story is both are false, but one is a falsehood that serves the truth, and one is a falsehood that serves deception. See? And that's the difference between the Batman and the Joker also. The Batman is a stand-up guy. The Batman is actually a true hero. He could live a life of luxurious wealth. He pretends to be like Tony Stark, a womanizer who lounges around all day, but he doesn't. He's more disciplined than a Marine.
This is true. Tony Stark is pretty disciplined.
Well, in the very beginning, he actually was a playboy. And then he becomes a lot more disciplined as he goes along. But, like, if you see the very beginning of the original Iron Man or something,
Oh, this is
he
true,
was
yeah.
originally a real playboy, while Bruce Wayne never was a playboy. He only pretended to be a playboy. Bruce Wayne is like
Bruce Wayne is like
Crisco.
not Kent Howard. What's his name? Me as a Shadow fan, I can't think of the Shadow's real name. Lamont Cranston.
Lamont
Lamont
Cranston.
Cranston, wealthy man about town. Now, in real life,
Yeah.
wealthy men about town do not go out and dress up as bats and fight crime. But the idea that the most useless person in society, not a guy who's wealthy because he's working hard, a guy who's wealthy because he's living off his parents' money, is actually the root of society, the servitor of law and justice who is allowing society to be maintained against the evils of organized crime or Shiwan Khan or Fu Manchu. That's an amazing and amusing contrast, as amazing and amusing as Superman dressing up as a nebbish, dressing up as a nobody.
Okay. I don't like Superman.
I love Superman.
Then,
I think sometimes
then you're
he's
not
not
allowed.
done well.
Then you're not
So
allowed
we-
to come to America.
So in some
Oh.
ways, Tony Stark is a reformed anti-hero.
Yeah.
Right.
When you say you don't like Superman, do you mean the original Superman movie or some other version of Superman?
I
think
I've never
original-
particularly liked the character. He's too powerful.
I think the original Superman movie is really good. And one thing I like about Superman
Oh, yeah.
is that he is really powerful. And I think powerful characters are very hard to write. Good writers can do amazing things with them, and not so good writers really, really can't. And I think part of Superman's problem is occasionally they just don't do the right things with him.
Let me point out
But the problem of what to do when you are a super powerful guy is one I really like.
Let me point out three things about Superman, which you won't. I'm not able to make you like the character, but I might be able to point out why those of us who do like the character like him. One, for all his power, he can't get a date with Lois Lane. Okay. Two,
Yeah.
still has to work for a living, and Perry White still yells at him. And three, while they're willing to throw parades for Superman, no one throws a parade for Clark Kent. He gets nothing for his work as saving the world over and
He
over
doesn't get
again.
any money. He
Okay.
doesn't get any help in his daily life.
Okay. I guess
And yet-
what I don't like about the character is it never feels like he's really in danger. He's bulletproof and
He's not in physical danger any more than a ghost would be. You can't shoot a ghost with a gun, but you can still make a ghost an interesting character because his dangers are moral. His danger is he can't afford to act like the Batman. He cannot afford to terrify people. He can't afford to just turn his head from his office in the Daily Planet, look across the city to Lex Luthor sitting at his desk in the LexCorp building, squint his eyes and have a laser come out and kill the man. Because he could do that, but he must not. He ought not. His problem is the problem of America as a superpower. We have too much power, and we have to use it very carefully. And sometimes we don't. See? So I
okay,
think the
all right,
character-
I get that. I hadn't thought of it like that.
and it depends on the writing. It depends on whether you got a good writer.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the writing, and that I've seen things where they really handled him badly, and I've seen some that I thought they did really
In
well.
the first Alexander Susskind movie, the main question was whether or not he was allowed to interfere in human destiny, and he has to defy the ghost of his father to actually do it, and he does it for the girl. He does it to save Lois Lane. He also has to decide whether or not to tell the truth, even though it means he's getting blackmailed by a blonde bimbo who is the gun moll for Lex Luthor. That happens in the movie. Both of those things are moral questions. He's not in physical danger of being shot with a gun. Nothing can hurt him but kryptonite. So yeah, you're right. He himself is in no danger. In order to make the story dramatic, you have to present some other kind of danger that he is vulnerable to. So.
Okay, fair enough.
If
I
like-
guess
if like-
I did enjoy the original Superman movies back in the 80s, but I was a kid too, so. But I
Yeah,
didn't.
Superman
I wasn't a fan of the recent Superman film.
Oh no, it was terrible. It was a piece of a word I can't say online.
Poop.
They whoever wrote that, they wrote a science fiction story about an alien that had nothing to do with the original Superman character. They crashed and burned the love triangle between Lois Lane, Superman, and Clark Kent. That's the most original love triangle in all of literature because it only has two people in it.
Yeah.
It's a two-sided triangle. It's brilliant. It was so brilliant that all the other comic books copied it. They had Hal Jordan and Star Sapphire and Carol Ferris, his boss, have a three-sided triangle, and they tried to do it over and over again, but it never really caught on with any of the characters. But for those characters, that's the central paradox of Superman, because every boy feels like he should be able to rip off his shirt and turn into Superman, and that he secretly is much more powerful and much more heroic than he looks like to the outside. The outside world mocks him, in the original Superman comic strips written by Spiegel and Schuster, there's scenes where like guys butt in on Clark dancing with Lois and shove him aside and take his girl. Okay, uh, in the movie they made this guy into an alien. They made him fail the moral quandary that is the central moral drama of Superman, which is they had him do the thing I was just mocking, where he just rips the head off of the bad guy, and I was like, what? What was the point of that? And they made it dark and murky. They were trying to do the Black Knight again, the Dark Knight again. They're trying to make it into film noir, and the only thing Superman cannot do is be film noir. He's a red, white, and blue all-American boy. He's a white hat. See, he's a rural hero, like the sheriff I mentioned in the earlier part of the broadcast, where he's the good guy. He's obviously the good guy, and he faces the bad guy down. And he obviously faces the bad guy down. The Batman, the guy of the city, he sneaks around. See, trying to make Superman sneaky is just dumb. So I hated that movie. I hated it.
Fair enough.
This comment is not really on our subject, but I found out recently that there is a real person named Victoria Von Doom.
There you go.
Yeah. Superman is all about power under restraint. It's like,
Okay.
well, like Jesus is the ultimate example of power under restraint, at least.
Yeah, he could call down legions of angels, and his men are going, hey, let's burn that town. And he goes, no. But his men were not all far off, because Elijah did that, or one of them did. They called down fire against Sodom and Gomorrah. You know.
Elijah.
Well, that was the
opposite. I think is one of the funniest stories in the Bible.
The one with where it eats the wood and everything up.
Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and
the
prophets are dancing around and cutting themselves, and Elijah's just mocking them. Where is he God? Yeah. Is he out relieving himself? It's really
maybe the gods are asleep. Hilarious. It's hilarious.
It's very, very funny. I really like it. One of my favorite Bible stories, actually.
Notice that Superman is a lot like a Moses character, because he's abandoned by his parents because of a disaster, and of course he's found and raised, of course, not by Pharaoh's daughter, but by two farmers from Kansas. But that was back in the day when farmers from Kansas were thought to be the core of American values. And thank God that Superman was raised by Mom, Pa Kent, not by the crime family.
The Punisher.
The Punisher, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I see what people like. I see what you mean about what people like about Superman.
Yeah, I think he can be done in a way where people see him as just kind of this big, quiet guy who can do anything, and there's no real tension. Particularly when they move him out of the Metropolis Daily Planet and they put him in like the Justice League or something. They take away a lot. He just kind of becomes a side issue a lot of the time.
Yeah.
They take away a lot of what makes the real Superman. But like if you go back and watch the Christopher Reeves, the original movie, that's a really good movie, and I think he does a really good job with it.
Okay.
Yeah, but he's in no danger from crooks. I agree. There's no tension there. There's no drama there. Now, a cynic would say Batman's not in any danger either, because he's got to survive through this. But the question is, how is he going to survive? Because he's just a guy with gadgets and some martial arts training who dresses like a bat. I actually, as a superhero, I actually rather like the low power guys better myself. I like the people like the Green Arrow. He shoots a pointed stick. I mean, that's his power.
Yes.
That's
yeah,
what
exactly.
he can do.
They're quite vulnerable. And it's interesting. Oh, actually, did anyone ever see?
But the Arrow TV show that's come out, I noticed that they play up the tension between him keeping a secret and his family life, and they play it like a soap opera. The drama there is the tension between the role of the superhero, the role of the vengeance of the vigilante, and the human toll it's taking on him. I rather like that.
I quite enjoy Arrow. So
they did a brilliant job with the driving up the tension by changing the origin story in one factor. They had his father die before his eyes, and his father turns out to be a crook who hands him a list of his crooked associates and says, "Get these people to avenge my death." and then he dies. Okay, so when Oliver Queen returns to the city 5 years later after having been stranded on the island, that was part of the original comic book origin story. He gets stranded on an island, he sees pirates, he makes himself a bow and arrow, and he shoots them. When he gets back to the city, he sees the whole city being run by pirates, and he decides to dress up like Robin Hood and shoot them with an arrow. But
Yep.
the TV show, by adding an additional weight to the code that Arrow has to abide by now has his father's dying wish is now a burden he has to shoulder. And because of that burden, he can't have a normal life. That makes it much more dramatic. So in any case, whenever you're trying to get more drama out of the tension between the code the hero has to abide by or the villain has to not abide by, and the person's human nature, in the case of the hero, he has to be tempted to break the code. In the case of the villain, he has to be tempted to obey the code. He has to have moments of heart, moments of weakness, where he goes, maybe I shouldn't actually act. Maybe I should spare this child. You see what I'm saying? That makes him an interesting villain. And to get the most drama, you put as much weight as those on you can. You just make it worse. You twist it. And I thought the guys in the Arrow did a good job with that. I thought the guys with Daredevil, the Daredevil TV show on Netflix, did a great job with that. They made him really pay the price for being the Daredevil. So,
Yes.
So I will agree with you that Superman never seems to pay much of a price. We don't see his life as a wreck. Although I will point out in the first movie his dad does die and he can't do anything to save him. So
That's okay.
in the stupid movie, his dad dies while he stands there with his thumb up his nose.
See, I think a good
The dad says, "Oh no, let me die. It's more important that I be killed."
I think a good writer could do a really good job with Superman, because I remember just a month or two ago, one day I looked around and I thought, I live in this hovel of a house sometimes, and we didn't have any money at the time, and blah blah blah. And I thought, what if I was really, really rich, and I listed the problems I have, and 90% of them wouldn't change, even if I had all the money in the universe. I would still have this problem I was dealing with. And
you still couldn't get a date with Lois Lane.
well, like, if I don't have enough time to do certain... I mean, obviously, if you have rich, you could have some people take care of certain of your jobs. But if you want to do something like be with your kids or write, nobody can do that for you, okay? You know what I mean? And that's just a little example. There's health issues. And health issues that we have no cure for at the moment. And other things like that within my friends and family and, and things like that. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, there are a great many things, like having somebody fall in love with you, or things like your dad dying or something like that, that no amount of power is going to solve. And John showed that to us for many years in the role-playing game he ran for about 15, 20 years, where our characters had the ability to make worlds. We could make entire worlds. It was something we did regularly and easily. But we still had all sorts of problems we couldn't solve, despite that we could make any material thing you wanted, including magic powers.
The problems were all moral problems.
They were all social problems. We had to convince the other powerful people to get along with each other, political problems. So it seems to me that all you would need to do to make, Superman really, really interesting is, show him solving easily the problems he can solve easily, and unable to solve the problems he can't solve with strength. No amount of being Superman necessarily makes your articles better for Perry White. If you come in and he doesn't like your work, nothing about being Superman itself makes you a better writer. Nothing about being Superman makes you necessarily get the girl. There's lots of things out there that you could throw at them where they have to solve a problem.
I'll point out that Superman is a law-abiding American citizen. No amount of being Superman will allow him to kill a villain.
And that, I was about to say, one of the most interesting things in the the game where you could scratch a line on the ground and make a planet was the choice of the American player characters, that we wanted to treat the other group of people with power. Let's call them the superheroes, though that's not what they were, just for ease of speaking. We wanted to treat them like equals and not railroad them.
Well, now
the problem of how to treat people who are weaker than you in almost every way as an equal because you respect them is really difficult.
Yeah.
Well, I could save a life if I break this law. I mean, you could write a whole comic, for years just dealing with the ramifications of that issue.
And what this is driving at is many people think of heroes as powerful people, not necessarily superpowered people. That's only one genre. But even in the science fiction or the fantasy field, the hero is often either the chosen one or the guy or the inventor who learns better, or he's the guy. He's the ordinary Joe, the astronaut who just happens to be the guy that got hit by the antenna and is left behind. Something puts him out of the ordinary, either of his own doing or it's done to him. But it's not the power of the hero that makes the drama. It's always the moral implications. It's always the mental implications. It's always the soap opera, the politics. The soap opera politics I'm listing as how you deal with other people, friends or enemies.
To use another example of a hero with whom we are all familiar, the most powerful person who ever walked on Earth, his story is really exciting to read. He had the ability to, just call down angels, and yet he let people kill him. Because he had a higher moral code he was living up to. He was trying to do God's will. And, that's actually a really interesting story if you sit and read through the Gospels. They're written in an old-fashioned way, but they're still really good stories.
Put yourselves into the shoes of like a Chinaman who's never heard of the Gospel before. As if you were coming across for the first time. The story is so mysterious and so striking. But if you look at it with the eyes of a playwright and look at what the drama is, I mean, here's a guy who can come back from the dead. So there's no plot tension because he's not going to get attacked by wild dogs or something when he's in the desert. But the first thing that happens is he gets tempted 3 times by the devil. And then he gets tempted again, or excuse me, I'm not sure if it's a legitimate temptation, but in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's so freaked out that he's sweating like blood. So there's drama there as to what's going on. He's asking his father to let this cup pass by him, and then he says, "Unless it's your will, let it be otherwise."
When I was in high school,
the drama of what's going on there is when George Orwell criticized C.S. Lewis's That Hid His Strength. He criticized it on the grounds that if God's on the side of one of the two parties in the drama, there's no tension because you know who's going to win. Now, far be it from me to disagree with so skilled a writer as George Orwell, but as a critic, he was dead wrong about that because you always know from any story. Does anyone believe that Sherlock Holmes is not going to solve the crime? Does anyone believe that Batman is going to fail and be stabbed to death by the Lemming, or whoever the villain of the week is? No.
I didn't know Mark Watney was going to get home.
What's that?
I didn't know Mark Watney was going to get home.
That's true.
But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that.
No, that's fine.
But that's a good point. I mean, it's just a good point about the book.
There are plot twists, and often you don't know if it's going to be tragedy or comedy. You don't know if it's going to have a happy ending or not. Those things are true. But the things you did know about, the plot tension didn't decrease because you happen to know. The fact that God's on the side of one side or the other doesn't tell you whether this guy is going to curse God and die, or whether this guy is going to sacrifice his ego and turn to God for help.
When John and I were first
doesn't change the fact that not every chess man on the chessboard is a bishop. Some of them are going to step from the black square to the white square, and vice versa.
When John and I were first married, he used to say this thing about, because back when he was an atheist, that anything that had God in it wouldn't be interesting. And I finally came to the conclusion he was dead wrong because I noticed how utterly fascinating the testimonies of healing by prayer in my church magazine are. Every single one is going to end with a healing by prayer because otherwise it wouldn't be in the magazine. But yet, they do, just because they lay out what happened and then how they prayed and how it resolved, and the degree to which the problem resolved. Some might resolve with, so-and-so passed on, but peace came to my heart, and another might resolve with, and they were healed. And I began to notice that they didn't lack in interest or drama in any way just because I knew, theoretically, what the outcome was going to be.
Okay.
And that's particularly true for things like comics or for ongoing characters like Sherlock Holmes. Once Sherlock Holmes has been in a dozen stories, even if you think the writer's going to kill him off at Rohrenbach Falls, he's probably going to come back to life again.
Well, back when I was a kid and we were watching TV, we were watching Star Trek or something. They never killed a major character. You knew they were going to end where they started because there wasn't any serial shows.
Right.
And they were still fascinating. They still managed to make the hour have something happen, and you were really worried for the characters. And your mind, I remember actually once as a child going, wait, they're going to be there next week. And it actually made me feel much better and less frightened.
Well,
but that was like, I had been watching for some years before that, and it never even occurred to me that was the case.
I'll also point out that a sonnet always has 14 lines, and so no one's going to be shocked or surprised when the 14th line is the last line, and you don't gain anything by having it be a surprise that there's a surprise 15th or 13th line. These things have certain forms to them, and the artistic form is part of the tension. The bow needs both a stick to make it straight and a string to make it bend. You need a tension between what the audience expects. What the audience expects is part of the art, and they'll feel cheated if you don't do it that way. And what the audience wants is a surprise. And whether or not the astronaut gets home is a surprise. If he got home on a magic carpet, that would just be a cheat, though. He has to get home within the structure of what rocketry and orbital mechanics allows for. He has to get home within a science fiction way if it's a science fiction story. If it's a fantasy story and you solve it in a science fiction way, that's actually mildly disappointing. If Bilbo Baggins' clothes did not turn invisible when he put the ring on, which is what would happen in a science fiction story, that would be disappointing. So you see what I'm saying about surprise? If you have God in a story, that merely lends, and that's like having it be a science fiction story or a fantasy story. That merely adds particular structure to the plot that you have to abide by. You can't have God turn out to be the villain, unless, of course, you're writing a Gnostic story like Avoid Shartaris by David Lindsay. But once you or Philip Pullman. Philip Pullman was basically writing a Gnostic story. The surprise in the story is how it's told, not in what the protocols of the art or the genre happen to be.
I will even say, most really good books, you can read them over and over again. And of course, once you've read them once, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's true.
If they're good, it's not because you don't know what the end is going to be, But I do agree with you that a reader who reads for entertainment wants to be shocked and surprised and will never read a book again. A reader who reads to immerse himself in the story wants to live the story again and again for the same reason he wants to visit friends of his again. But to take Jason's side, it is completely true that when they write a Superman story where they don't put him into a problem, where they don't go to the trouble to have a problem
I agree.
that Superman has trouble solving, then he's really dull.
I agree. He's too powerful and he's too good to do much dramatically with him. I don't like stories where they show him being corrupt. If he's less moral and virtuous than a Boy Scout, I don't believe it. I don't believe that's Superman.
One of the reasons I think Batman and Superman...
Batman I could see be tempted to shoot the Punisher, even though they're from two different universes, because those guys are both gray hats. Those guys are both on the edge. So.
But I do think that Batman and Superman make good foils for each other. Because then you have the guy who wants to do things straightforwardly and the guy who wants to do them, who's willing to work in the dark, kind of, at odds with their procedures, their MO are at odds.
Yeah, their MO is at odds, their goals are at odds. One's a city mouse, one's a country mouse. One's a rich guy, one's a farm boy. They're very opposite.
Yeah. The comment about genre expectations, it maybe think of the little quip in Star Trek Deep Space Nine about Cardassian detective stories where everybody is always guilty, but the trick is to find out who is guilty of what.
I was going to say, did anybody see the TV series Spooks, which I always really enjoyed? And what's one of the interesting things about it is no characters in the whole series are safe. Like, you know how you're saying in Star Trek each week, the main characters are going to be there next week.
Yeah. This is the opposite.
Spooks, totally not like that. There's one character that survives the entire... Well, there's a couple of characters... There's one major character that survives the entire series, and there's a point where you're going, oh, he's probably not going to make it.
Yeah.
But other than that, They go through characters like you wouldn't believe.
Well,
They sort of leave or
nowadays,
get killed off, or
nowadays it's much more common to kill off major characters. I mean, it used to be it only ever happened if the actor, died or left or something.
Well, the joke,
Nowadays, it's a lot more common, and sometimes I think it's well done, and sometimes it's. I'll tell you a brief story. John and I once had a role-playing game that we ran in our early days before we had kids, and we were just playing around, and there was a character we both liked called Ulster. And because it was trying to run a kind of a realistic game, Ulster got injured and he died. And then we really weren't interested in the game anymore because, the really enjoyable thing about the game had been the byplay between the main character and Ulster. And that Ulster principle, I begin to notice in any series where they kill too many characters. Suddenly, if things are too realistic, it stops being enjoyable, I was watching because I liked that character. You know what I mean?
yes,
Yeah.
And, yes, you get, in a lot of these things, and I think of this, a lot of
what if the
shows have
character-
this phenomenon, not just with death, with other things too. They do something that's really dramatic, and they get a huge punch for it. But the price is that the rest of the shows following it have to have that as if it actually happened, and you don't really want the story once that's happened.
Yeah, what if the character that killed off was your favorite character? What if you
Yeah.
really liked that Stark?
Yeah.
okay, fair enough. Well, actually, one of the nice things about Spooks was
But that's just I'll point out that's just a difference of taste.
But some
people-
shows do it
some
well.
people
I mean, it
really-
depends on how it
some
is.
people-
Some
some
stories
people
that if
really
you know
do.
that's what the
Some readers really enjoy not knowing who's going to live and who's going to die once the spooks come out of the haunted house. I mean that's the driver for them, and they would be and they're simply bored if they know the guy in the red shirt's going to die and the guy in the first officer is safe. And not safe for any in-game reason. Not safe because the plot says he's safe. Safe because the writer says he's safe. Because the actor's going to be here next week.
okay.
Even in the story, let me back up. The thing that George Orwell was criticizing, the book that he was criticizing C.S. Lewis for, was called That Hideous Strength. And in That Hideous Strength, the main character, Mark Studdock, does live in a universe where God is one of the characters in the fictional universe, but you don't know whether he's going to rise or fall. You don't know whether he's going to join with the bad guys because he's clearly tempted to, or whether he's going to turn over a new leaf. And when he turns over a new leaf at the end, surprise ending, that's only the beginning of his story. So the story that we're reading ends, and you don't see him earn his happy ending or even get a happy ending, because he's just taken the first step on a long and difficult road. And so, unlike what Orwell said, you really did not know that the astronaut
Well,
was
it's
going
like
to
what I said about the testimonies, and the ones that really that I think make the best example is when you read about someone with a troubled marriage, and sometimes the result is they end up single and in peace, and sometimes they end up single and with a new husband, and sometimes their broken marriage is healed. Those are three entirely different outcomes that happen because of the will of God, but it's not like you knew ahead of time which of those things was going to happen or that they happen easily. That's the other thing. Having God in the picture doesn't make it that things are easy, because we have vice and we have, the will. I remember a line from a book I liked that had a kind of spiritual quality to it, where the person said, some people fail because of their own weaknesses, and some people fail because of the weaknesses of others. Sometimes you don't get to win just because God wins in the long run,
Yes. All right.
Well, it's a little after 5. We may want to.
I was going to say it's been 2 hours. Do we want to offer final thoughts and then wrap this up? I've found this a fascinating conversation, so I've learned a lot. Thank you.
I love talking about heroes and villains. It's one of my, particularly talking about heroes, who I feel are under appreciated nowadays, is a favorite topic. So I really enjoyed this. I don't think it would be a bad thing maybe to try it again in 6 months if we could get more people and hear somebody else's take.
Yeah. Let me make a closing statement.
Sure.
I like writing villains who have some hero in them, because if they're completely wretched, there's no drama.
Yes.
Some of the most powerful stories, science fiction, fantasy stories I've ever read were always ones about the guy who turns over a new leaf. And sometimes it fails. In Lord of the Rings, spoiler warning, surprise ending, Sméagol does not make it. He does not actually reform his life, even though he's been attempted to by Frodo.
Yeah, he gives in at the end,
Frodo doesn't
doesn't
make
he?
it either. The temptation is too great for him. He doesn't betray the code, but he caves. He collapses at the very end. The fact that your hero is a hero doesn't mean he's necessarily going to win. If your hero is Superman, it does mean you can't have him be all that tempted, because that would destroy the point of the character. But if he's Batman, if he's a gray hat, he can clearly be tempted. And some of the heroes, I mean, Saint Peter denied Christ, for goodness sake. I mean, some of the Judas might have been spared if he had asked for if he had repented. If he had asked for forgiveness, he might not have ended up dead, hanged himself. We don't know.
Yeah, that's
We don't know
something
how
I
we're-
think about sometimes. He'd lasted a day or two more. He probably would have been forgiven, you
He
know. But
lasted
he,
3 days. Christ would have come in and offered him a piece of fish. You know,
Yes.
who knows? Who knows? So the idea that the idea that good heroes are boring is a boring idea. That's an idea that's said by people who don't know how hard good is, because good is really hard. Villainy is easy. Villainy is relaxing. Villainy is when when you take a break, take a break from morality. Or excuse me, I should say, villainy is actually when you feel a sense of injured merit. You think you deserve better. You think that life has cheated you, and you're trying to get back at it. But you can make dramatic heroes and dramatic villains just by keeping in mind what the tension is. And I myself think that the modern idea of trying to destroy the code by showing that villains are victims and heroes are oppressors is just the worst parts of Marxism and feminism and all these isms that are a mental disease that is corroding our culture. I think they're just despicable. And even, I could not reread Watchmen. I read it when I was a kid. I enjoyed it tremendously. When I went to see the movie, I walked out of the movie and I said, why did I enjoy that stupid story? That story was terrible.
I didn't go to see the movie, and I think it was because I had a little
That
kid
story
at the
was
time.
sticking its finger in my eye. That story was telling me my life was worthless.
But
I rooted for Rorschach. You know,
John
the
and our
good-
friend were at the movie, and while they were there, and I had been really looking forward to it originally, I suddenly realized how really awful the story was, and how it was like what I was saying before about when I was talking about fan fiction and heckler fiction. My romanticism of my idea of what a hero is was what made the story good, and it wasn't really in the story. I was just deceived.
Yeah. Now I like certain film noir stories where the gray hats fight the black hats. That seems to me to have perfectly dramatic. Even a movie like High Noon with Gary Cooper, I think, is a bit of a noir story. But stories that are sub-noir, that are heckler fiction, and my hat's off to you, that's a brilliant phrase, where they're trying to make fun of the original story, where the sheriff is not a brave guy, like in an old-fashioned story, and he's not even a flawed hero like in a film noir story. He's not a hero at all because heroism doesn't exist. Those stories, I think, are despicable. Okay, those are stories where a guy gets stranded on Mars and he dies. You know, there's nothing to them. He's a victim.
Yeah.
Feel sorry for him, not because of anything he did, not because he deserves you to feel sorry for him, but because he's the designated victim for this week. Good grief.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use heckler fiction in my article when I get to it.
I'm going to
name my
next child. I'm going to name my next child Heckler Fiction, right?
We're having another child.
Well, obviously
Judge is
not.
unaware of this.
Not with a name like Heckler Fiction.
I hope you bring me in on this. You know, I feel a bit of a shock to come home and find somebody just waiting here.
Didn't you
Some-
check your
some
list of things
revelation.
to do?
So anyway, well,
Did
thank
you-
you, everybody.
Do you guys acquire adoptive children like most people acquire rescue dogs?
It's funny you say that because just this week, the gentleman who does Catholic Geek Radio had a picture of a woman in a grocery store with a little kid on a leash, and the caption was, "Next time you see this, go and ask if it's a rescue." And I started laughing because Well, if it's an adopted kid, it is a rescue, and it just it reminded me of my life. But
Yeah.
yeah, there was a time when the kids wanted us to go back to China and get another little girl, but I kind of think that now they're a bit older that going back to having another little one is a little bit beyond our range, at least
I
as
don't
I
think I
can
can wait.
foresee it.
I don't think I can wait another 5 years of paperwork.
Yeah.
I'm not that much of a hero.
Yeah, well, we have 4, and it is a pretty good amount. So right
No,
right
it's
now we're
good.
pretty happy with it. But we will keep Heckler Fiction in mind should we decide we need another one, or maybe
Right.
a cat. Heckler would be a great
I
name for a cat.
I did charge the pile of paperwork I had to sign in China with a pen in my hand as bravely as any knight who had to climb a mountain of glass to save the princess. And I did save the princess, and she's in the next room right now, so thank goodness for that.
She came down to dinner yesterday, and John and the boys were all singing, "Hail to the King, hail to the Queen, hail to the Princess, Bing Bing." So she is a princess. All right, gentlemen, thank you so
All right.
much.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you, everyone. I'll stop broadcasting.